welcome to a next episode of the World Open Innovation Conversations. My name is Marcel Bogers. I'm a professor of open and collaborative innovation at Eindhoven University of Technology. And it's a great pleasure to have our special guest today, Henry Chesbrough. I usually say a man who doesn't need any introduction, especially in the open innovation context. But maybe I allow you to say a few words about who you are before we kick off the actual podcast.
Happy to do that. And Marcel, thank you for having me. I'm presently a professor at Lewis University in Rome of open innovation and sustainability. And I was the founding faculty director of the Garwood Center for Corporate Innovation at UC Berkeley. So I have a foot in two camps, Berkeley and Italy, at the current time.
Wonderful. And especially for those who are watching us, they may notice we are wearing maybe not the typical clothing that we would usually wear to work anyway. And for those who are listening, we will just briefly describe it because we are actually here in Eindhoven. So that's the first thing to say. And we are here because, Henry, you received yesterday the honorary doctorate from our university. And this actually connects to what we are wearing because this is a jersey of PSV Eindhoven, the local football or soccer club. So maybe you should explain a little bit why we are wearing this, because you were the one who actually showed up in the shirt and I happened to have one here in the office. And I had a whole script prepared of what we would talk about, but I think this is maybe the first thing that we should explain.
So to me, this was one of the delightful surprises of the ceremony yesterday. I was thrilled to be recognized with an honorary doctorate. I did not know and could not expect that I would also be able to join the team here in the Eindhoven ecosystem. So I'm really thrilled with the jersey, and it really nicely captures some of the connections that we're going to talk about today that have been formed over many years between Berkeley and Eindhoven, between open innovation and some of the key companies here in the region. So the jersey to me was just wonderful. And even the sizing is good because many times European clothes, for many Americans, me included, they're cut too narrowly and so they fit uncomfortably, but this feels great.
So you're ready to go onto the pitch?
I am ready to be part of the team.
But to explain a few more details about it, the reason why I presented you this gift and how I also explained it yesterday, there are actually a couple of components. There's a big story, I think, behind the shirt, because first of all, for the ones who are watching, we can show on the front the sponsor is Brainport Eindhoven. So it's a kind of an open innovation in action, in the sense that usually it's one single sponsor. It used to be Philips from the region here. That's what the P stands for. It's a Philips sporting club. But a few years ago there was more of basically a consortium of companies who said, let's do this together. That's why I called it open innovation, and let's focus more on the ecosystem rather than on the individual company. So in itself, I think it's an interesting example. Plus, Brainport, that's what we call the region here, we'll talk about it a little bit more, is really something that emerged from the open innovation thinking, and I'll ask you about that afterwards to explain that a little bit more. So that is nicely represented. On the back, of course, people cannot see that now, but there are pictures available on social media and so on. There's actually number 12, well, of course there's your name, Chesbrough, and number 12. And the reason for having number 12 is, for those who don't know, in football or soccer, you play with 11 players. And often we say that the 12th player is representing the fans or the community around it. And for me also, your work on building the open innovation community is really represented through that number. And then on the side, and that's very special about your shirt, why I like it even more than the one I'm wearing, is the red-white flag of the province we live in here, which is North Brabant. which is really known for warmth and hospitality and taking care of one another. And that also very much represented in at least how I got to know you over the years and what you have meant for the open innovation community as well. Anyway, that's a long story about the idea behind that shirt, and of course I'm happy that you were pleasantly surprised by it, and even more happy that you showed up in it
Yes.
in the office here today. But maybe we can go back a little bit to that history, because I think there's a connection between how you started thinking about and working with open innovation in the early years, also when you originally published that book, and also how this is connected to the story of Philips and Brainport, as I briefly referred to it. So could you reflect a little bit on the original development of that concept of open innovation? Maybe you can frame it a little bit in sort of the regional context we are in here, but then of course it has some wider implications you may reflect about as well.
Yes, the thinking that led to the book in 2003 that was open innovation, the evidence in that book is almost exclusively from the US, and most of it from Silicon Valley. And that's a perfectly fine place to think about innovation, but it's a big world out there. And so one of the things that happened shortly after the book came out is I was contacted by Rick Harvig, who was at the time the Chief Technology Officer at Philips, and invited by Rick to come to Eindhoven to give a series of lectures for a program that ended up taking place over several years, and brought me back frequently to do that. And what was really encouraging to me was Philips' interest in this work really coincided with some structural changes that they were going through as a corporation. They had traditionally been, and Rick would have acknowledged this, they had been very closed. They had deep internal research and development capabilities, but they really kept it to themselves. And they really did not leverage external knowledge very effectively, nor, it must be said, were they successful in creating international standards for their technologies very effectively. They often had, for example, in video cassette recorders, VCRs, they had very good products, but they lost out to Japanese companies who did a better job of creating standards for the formatted content to be played on these devices. So even though Philips had perhaps better technology, it was the Japanese companies that really won the competition in the long run. So for a lot of reasons, Philips was changing, and when they encountered my book, they saw some concepts that made sense to them for their own future. And for me, it was a chance to see some of the ideas that I was developing in one region, the US, being applied in a different region here in the Netherlands. So it led to several years of discussions and lectures. I learned a lot in that process, and then the things that have subsequently developed, I've been thrilled to see where some of these ideas have gone.
And so in that sense you would say that has also influenced you in how you conceptualize the notion of open innovation further, and maybe it's not just that one example, of course, right? But how over the years have you developed your thinking around that, also learning from the different examples you saw around the world?
One of the things that I learned from Eindhoven and the region here is that open innovation had useful explanatory power outside of the original area that I did my research. And once I really saw that, it gave me more confidence to make broader claims about this model. I was careful not to oversell my model in the beginning because I knew my evidence was somewhat limited. Sure. But with the experiences at places like Philips, but also I would say a company like DSM, and also AkzoNobel, I could see that these concepts were being useful for them to make sense of their situation and what path forward would work best for them. That gave me confidence to say open innovation has more general utility and is a more globally relevant model than I initially dared to hope.
And if you, let's say then we fast forward, right? So we have that whole history behind us, and now we are here like talking about the Brainport ecosystem. And maybe for those who are curious about why it's called Brainport, let me briefly explain. In the sense that here in the Netherlands we have, of course, a well-known airport, Schiphol in Amsterdam, which is then the airport, let's say. We also have Rotterdam, which is more with the very large harbor, of course, so more the seaport, let's say. And then part of this history, it's a long story, but I'll keep it short now, is also the idea that, well, here we have the knowledge. And in this
Brainport.
The Brainport. So this
Yes.
is basically in brief where that name is coming from. But of course, besides the name, there's a lot behind it. And this is why I say if we fast forward now, so with that whole history behind us, how do you currently, or how do you view at the current situation in the Brainport region? But I actually asked the question, not because it's about Brainport, but how do you view the general importance of thinking and working in broader ecosystems, which from my perspective is also a little bit, let's say, the next level of open innovation, where you of course get a more complex set of actors working together. So I'm curious about your reflection on that. So maybe we can use the Brainport as one example how you view it, but then the more general story really is about how can we look at this notion of ecosystem innovation ecosystems or regional ecosystems more generally.
The Open Innovation book traces the evolution of industrial innovation from this internal closed model to a more open and distributed model. As I said a moment ago, with Philips, they themselves were going through such a transition, so it seemed quite relevant to them. If we step back from that experience, what's happening is that more and more useful knowledge is being generated in a more distributed, decentralized way. Having TU Eindhoven here next to Philips helps to both create new knowledge, but also to distribute and disseminate it more widely. Out at the Philips High Tech Campus, which is today Brainport, in the physical real estate that was there, instead of having a single company with 1,500 researchers, as it was in the beginning, by opening up the campus, there are now, I think, 12,000 or maybe more researchers from, I think, more than 100 different companies. So even in the physical manifestation, you can see how knowledge production and use is being spread over a much wider surface area. Mm-hmm. And that creates more opportunities for startups, for SMEs, for graduates of TU Eindhoven looking for jobs. It gives inspiration to people who want to perhaps be an entrepreneur themselves, that these things are possible. And it gives examples and demonstrations of other organizations who started themselves as startups or spin-offs and what they were able to do. So all of this creates many more pathways for knowledge to be produced and for knowledge to be distributed and used.
Yeah. And so you mentioned, for example, the university, there are large firms, there are small firms. And we have Brainport Development, which is also an economic development agency that's behind some
that
of
we're
this,
wearing the jerseys
yes,
right now.
Exactly. For me, that links also to this notion of orchestration within the ecosystem. So, of course, there are different models on that. There's a lot of research, obviously, going on. And how would you reflect on that notion? And have you maybe seen different kinds of examples, not only here, maybe back in Berkeley or other parts of the world? How does the manifestation of the orchestration and what is the impact of that within the ecosystem? What are different maybe types or patterns you have observed?
Yes, it's a good point. I didn't get to the ecosystem part of
This was my way
answering your
to
last
get
question.
back to that, yes.
In the Open Innovation book, much of the discussion and the examples were based on two organizations working alongside each other to produce something, and that certainly was important. But it is absolutely true that, and Brainport is a region, Silicon Valley would be another region that demonstrates that it isn't simply bilateral or dyadic collaboration, but there is a larger ecosystem involved. And the ecosystem metaphor I take quite seriously for these phenomena, because in an ecosystem, organizations that are striving to survive, to reproduce, to grow, their behaviors in a well-balanced ecosystem enhance the ability of other organisms to do the same thing. So my win is not your loss. We both draw resources from the resource base. We contribute to the resource base in the ecosystem, and in a well-balanced ecosystem, all of that can grow and be quite healthy and positive for the participants in the ecosystem. So that, I think, goes well beyond a bilateral collaboration, and suggests that a healthy innovation ecosystem needs strong sources that generate knowledge. It needs places where that knowledge is really put to work and converted into new resources, some of which are then reinvested in the knowledge production for the next generation. So I do think the ecosystem metaphor works well, and I'm reminded again on this visit how that also has implications for universities and the work that universities do. And I think some of what's going on here at TU Eindhoven is actively exploring that.
Yes, and indeed, I think also in our own research group, we have quite some research on these different topics, including on the role of university, also ecosystem orchestration in general. So, and I see it also in the, let's say, the broader open innovation community as one of the topics that has been really gained a lot of interest. Obviously also reflected by the growing importance of this way of thinking in practice as well. But then on that basis, what would you say are maybe some of the challenges of working in ecosystems? Because we understand it's a kind of, it can be a positive sum game. This is the complementary surplus, and then the joint value creation, as we would call it. But where do you see some of the key challenges of working in ecosystems in that sense?
Well, again, if we take the ecosystem metaphor seriously, there was a professor at UCLA named Jared Diamond who wrote about ecosystem collapse, looking at things like Easter Island as one example, but he has several in his research, where ecosystems that at one time seemed to be healthy and growing became so imbalanced that the entire ecosystem collapsed. So that is a danger. If one organism in the ecosystem becomes too dominant, that can create problems for the whole ecosystem and even for the survival of that organism. So this question is not simply of academic interest. It has lots of implications. So that's one area. Another one is where does an ecosystem begin and where does it end? What's in, what's out? If we aren't careful in defining what we mean, it can become very fuzzy and very general. And then I think we lose some of the traction and the work becomes less disciplined. So keeping clear on our definitions in ecosystems is good. So if we think about ecosystem failures as well as success, if we define our terms clearly and stick to it, I'm confident that there's a lot we're going to learn in this ecosystem area.
Okay, and I agree, of course, and I think it's very good reflections. As we are drawing to a close also of our podcast here, I'm also then interested in how this all ties back to open innovation as you originally conceived it, which is very much an organization-centered model or framework. We kind of open up to the notion of ecosystems and reflected on several aspects of that. But if we want to close that circle, how does that come back, or what implications does it maybe have for open innovation research and practice?
So the research behind open innovation was done in the late 90s and early 2000s, mostly in the US, mostly in Silicon Valley. Today, as we're talking on our podcast, the American university research system is under attack. The globalization of industry that was a driving force in the late 90s and early 2000s is giving rise to more geopolitical competition in clubs. So some of the resource base, to keep with the ecosystem metaphor, the resource base itself is shifting and changing. And since open innovation feeds on the resources in the ecosystem, these are tectonic shifts that are going to have strong implications for how open innovation functions. We might, for example, instead of globalization, we might have clubs where groupings of nations do collaborate well within the club, but maybe don't share well across the clubs. That could be one implication. If the university research that fed Silicon Valley so well for many years, if that gets negatively impacted, innovation is going to shift to other regions where the research base remains strong. So these are some of the locus of innovation depends a lot on the resource base. The use of innovation will depend on whatever comes after globalization.
And then again, how does that tie back to open innovation as a more narrow concept? Is that part of the solution, or do you see a shift in how where we draw the boundaries?
I do see a shift in where we draw the boundaries. I am encouraged by the continued rise of things like open source, where I think open source does transcend the clubs. If we can all go to GitHub and download repositories of our latest LLMs or other technology models, and we can all use it and build on it and contribute back to it, that will help some. But open innovation is not able to escape the forces that are driving the shift away from globalization, and it depends greatly on useful research being generated. And if that itself is being threatened, that could cause open innovation to slow down or shift the regions in which open innovation is more pronounced away from Silicon Valley and even away from the US.
Yeah. So maybe on that basis, to end the podcast here, do you have any particular call to action for both researchers and practitioners and perhaps policymakers as well?
Well, I had the opportunity to give a short address yesterday, and one of my points in that address was the policies in the US to revive the semiconductor industry. In my judgment, they lack an ecosystem perspective. They focus on creating new factories to build the chips, but they don't increase the funding for semiconductor research to help advance those processes. They don't contribute to workforce training and development to staff these factories. And so without paying attention to the surrounding ecosystem that supports semiconductor manufacturing, the US policies, in my judgment, are going to be much less effective than they otherwise could have been. Or to say it differently, you might be able to build the foundries, but you're not going to be able to sustain them over time if you aren't also building and nurturing the ecosystem that feeds them. So once again, the ecosystem metaphor proves to be very important, even in something as tactical as how to revive semiconductor manufacturing in the United States.
Yeah. So my conclusion from that is that we, even though we do live in challenging times, and it's of course interesting to see what will happen in the future, there may be some implications for open innovation as well. As a framework and as a mindset, it can play a role in addressing some of those global challenges and seeing how that can also create local impact and maybe get a new equilibrium in the world, having openness as part of the equation.
I think my parting thought would be, with your help and that of some other wonderful scholars, we have turned open innovation into a vibrant academic community and with a number of active industry participants as well. And so as these tectonic shifts are taking place, there is alongside this a increasingly global community of scholars and managers that are using open innovation in very creative and productive ways. And I'm confident that as a community, we will adapt and figure out good things to be doing going forward. Even if sitting here today, we can't necessarily see the path, by working as a community and getting all these different people touching different parts of innovation, I think we will together find a good way forward.
And on that note, it's as such not an accident that in the World Open Innovation Conference coming up this November in Bilbao, we have as a conference theme Open Innovation in Times of Uncertainty. So I think it's very fitting, and we hope to see many people there as well. Thank you very much for this podcast. Congratulations again on your honorary doctorate. And we look forward to working together, of course, in the future and addressing some of these challenges and going forward.
Thank you, Marcel.
Thank you, Henry. Thanks for listening.